Get on up.
Everybody right there.
Get into it.
Everybody right there.
Get involved.
Everybody just come on up. Come on up.
Serdar, who recently curated a show at Squeaky Wheel called The Shape of a Pocket. We're going to be talking about that. We'll be talking about some very exciting workshops coming up at Squeaky Wheel and talking about the role of digital arts in Buffalo's scene. We'll be live streaming today's show from our Facebook page, so check out facebook.com/PPGBuffalo for real-time footage, and feel free to leave a comment or a question on PPG's Facebook page. We'll try and address it in the short video that we shoot at the end of the program. You can find videos from previous week's shows on our YouTube page, and you can find that either on YouTube or via our website, ppgbuffalo.org. Before we get started, a couple of announcements for you. There will be a voter uprising training hosted by Niagara Organizing Alliance for Hope and Voice Buffalo. That'll be this Saturday, August 12th, from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. They'll be covering topics like canvassing, voter registration, the election process, roles of elected officials, effective meetings with public officials, etc. That is a voter uprising training. You can find out more about that from Voice Buffalo, one of our partners. Also want to let you know that every police district in Buffalo has a monthly meeting, and that is a good place for you to go voice your concerns about policing in Buffalo. The meetings for the E and C districts are this Wednesday, August 9th at 6 p.m. The E district meeting at 2777 Bailey, C district meeting at 693 East Ferry. The B district meeting is Monday, August 14th, 6 p.m. at First Presbyterian Church on Symphony Circle. And if you haven't read our report on community policing, check that out on our website or the Open Buffalo website. You'll find a host of facts and analysis about policing in Buffalo and 32 recommendations for change in the way we do policing, aimed to get at some of the racial disparities and other issues that we're seeing with our criminal justice system. I urge you to take a look at that report and then go to those district meetings and ask the precinct chiefs about policing and about some of those recommendations that we've made. Things like requiring all officers to do community policing, about improving the role of restorative justice and diversion in our policing, all kinds of information in those reports. Hope you will check that out and then go to those district meetings and talk directly to the police about ways to improve community police relations here in Buffalo. So with that, I want to welcome Ekrem Serdar from Squeaky Wheel to the show. Thanks for being here, Ekrem.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So for those who haven't experienced the joys of Squeaky Wheel yet, tell us just briefly, what is Squeaky Wheel?
Sure. Squeaky Wheel is a media arts center that's been around since 1985. We were founded by the likes of Tony Conrad, Julie Zando, and Chris Hill, specifically to give access to our region to media arts equipment. Remember, this is the 80s when video equipment was still very, very expensive and so on. So it made a lot more sense for everyone to come together and chip in and find grants and to be able to purchase this equipment and offer it to the community. And along with that, also workshops so people could learn how to use these tools. With this, we've gone through many, many different iterations. Nowadays, we live right here in the same building as y'all in 6-1 in the Market Arcade building. And we continue to offer access to lots of different equipment. You can rent projectors, cameras. You can use our computers that have the latest Adobe Creative Suite software. You can take all sorts of classes, and you can see the many, many amazing artists, both regional, national, international, that we bring in our screenings and exhibition programs.
So there's, I'm sure, one set of people who use your resources who are professionals or want to be professionals in the realm of media arts. Tell us a little bit about people who aren't going to be professionals in this world but can still get value from learning some of these tools and getting access to the resources that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, the people who come in and use our facilities aren't only artists and professionals. It's everybody for example, people who have old home movies and they just need help to get them transferred on Super 8. You know, it's people who just need a camera to be able to document a wedding and so on. So, you know, we don't, like, our equipment is all open to, like, all sorts of folks who, like, want to do anything that they need. And similarly with the classes, yes, of course, like a lot of them will help in terms of professionally, like your prospects and so on. But there's, a lot of, one of our main focuses in artists, the kind of artists that we tend to focus on are people who don't necessarily work in an industrial sphere. So these are folks who are working on their own, maybe with a couple of friends. Their budget is $10, $100, maybe $1,000. So we want to encourage this thing that media arts isn't only a sort of thing that is only accessible to the, to people who have billions and billions and have to work within a very industrial structure, but that this is something that you can be a part of as well.
So the sort of grassroots artists who make use of your facilities. A lot of our listeners are active in neighborhood groups like block clubs or faith-based groups or small nonprofit organizations. Are there some resources that you offer that they might want to make use of, or some? When you kind of look out on the scene, do you say, "Oh, I wish they knew about us because that would really help them if they made use of Squeaky Wheel"?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, this is things like projectors for any sort of events that they want to cover. For people who are covering protests and things like that, we've always been a resource for that. Even in the early '90s, when there were the spring of life, the sort of like vehement anti-abortion protests happened in Buffalo, Squeaky Wheel would basically like close up shop and shoot a counter documentary that went along with the counter protest, Spring of Lives. So for anybody, all our equipment is very, very affordable, so are our master classes and workshops and so on. So these are resources for people who are working in sort of civic groups and sort of activist groups that they can use up, and that we've always been open to.
You're listening to The Public Good with our guest today, Ekrem Serdar from Squeaky Wheel. Ekrem, you recently curated a show called The Shape of a Pocket that had a theme of resistance. So tell us a little bit about how that show came about and what it means to you.
Sure. Shape of a Pocket is named after a book of essays by the recently deceased writer, art critic, screenplay writer John Berger, who has always been a sort of who always played a large part in my sort of like intellectual upbringing. He was a sort of lifelong Marxist, a very sort of acute critic of both art, but as well as the ways that capital works within art. And in 2016, this was around last summer, so before the presidential election, but certainly when all those sorts of feelings were in the air, it occurred to me to sort of, or not necessarily it occurred to me, but I wanted to see what the region would sort of respond to if we had an open call focusing on forms of resistance. And this isn't only forms of resistance that people can take personally, but also within an institutional sphere like Squeaky Wheel. What does it mean for a work to call itself a sort of resisting work of art within the sort of institutional sort of white wall context and so on. And so earlier this spring, we had an open call that went out to the 17 counties of Western New York, and we had a lot of great applications. Me and 2 other jury members sort of went through them. They had their recommendations. And from there, we chose about 12 artists, and along with a collective that have variously contributed installations, screenings, as well as performances that took place on opening night. And there's a couple of workshops and public programs with the exhibition that are still upcoming as well.
Oh, okay. And so folks can still experience The Shape of the Pocket at Squeaky Wheel?
Absolutely, absolutely. The exhibition runs through August 26th. It includes everything from interactive works to video games to locative sound walks. And in terms of workshops, like for example, this Saturday at 3 p.m., one of our artists, Tony Yannick, will be teaching an ad hoc tactical network workshop where you can sort of create your own Wi-Fi network using a Raspberry Pi. The benefits of it, and he's also going to be talking about how artists and activists have used these kinds of like private sort of mesh networks like in the past several years. The benefits of that, of course, is privacy. You can have encrypted communications, you can have local communications that aren't available to the vaster internet, and so I'm very excited about that workshop.
So that's a workshop. Tell us again when that is.
That is on Saturday, August 12th at 3 p.m.
At Squeaky Wheel.
At Squeaky Wheel.
And just summarize again what folks would learn if they come to that.
Sure. They'll be learning some very sort of basic coding, on how to set up their own Wi-Fi networks using a Raspberry Pi, which is a sort of very cheap, very basic, basically just like piece of silicone that has some, you know, that has some circuits on it, basically.
Yeah.
So his piece in the exhibit is actually running on a Raspberry Pi,
Okay.
which is, and it's there's a local Wi-Fi network currently at Squeaky Wheel that's only accessible to folks within like the sort of block radius that we're in,
Yeah.
and people can access and communicate to each other through that as well.
And so, in putting together and then mounting this exhibit, what are some of the things you learned about how people in this region are interpreting resistance, and what role the arts play in the idea of resistance?
Sure. I think a lot of the works that we received very much focus on the artists' bodies themselves. That is often, this is a somewhat pessimistic perhaps way to look at it, but that is at the end of the day what is at stake is our bodies, right? That is the sort of last stance that we have is our flesh, which can be hurt, harmed, and but can also dance and do all sorts of other things. So I think a lot of artists sort of like investigated not only their own bodies but also other people's bodies and mirrors and so on as well. The audience's bodies as they look through, like walk through the gallery and so on. So that was sort of like a predominant theme that sort of came about. And of course things like, you know, like grander type, sort of larger contextual things like, you know, police violence, surveillance. These are all sort of topics that sort of came about through a lot of the submissions.
Right, right. Well, I know that you've got some residencies that we want to talk about, some artists coming in from out of town doing really interesting things in Buffalo. So tell us a little bit about that program.
Sure. So this is our artist residency program that has been, Squeaky Wheel has long since, especially at least since the early 2000s, if not, much longer than that, has always had artist residencies where we invite folks from nationally, locally, internationally, to come to Buffalo to work on their work. This is, we are currently in the third iteration of our workspace residency. This is a collaboration between us, Buffalo Game Space that teaches video game design and looks at VR and things like that, Buffalo Lab, which is part of the Foundry. They do things like 3D printing as well as other sort of makerspace type things, and Silo City, which is of course our sort of giant treasure of a performative space. And this is all through support from the National Endowment for the Arts. The residents this year are here for 3 weeks. They arrived this past Saturday. We have 6 amazing residents, one of whom lives in Buffalo, Caroline Doherty, as well as the folks from all sorts of other places as well. We have 2 research residents who are here sort of working on their book called on the radical filmmaker Peter Watkins. Their names are Rachel Rakes and Leo Goldsmith. They're sort of longtime curators and scholars, film editors at the Brooklyn Rail. We have artists like Dennis Tortum, who's coming in from Boston, and he's going to be teaching a workshop on virtual reality and documentary. We have folks like Jatavia Gary, who is investigating topics such as Black fugitivity and is working on her sort of diptych called the Giverny diptych. And she also works on handmade film and so on, and she's also going to be teaching a workshop for our youth program tomorrow on handmade film.
Tell us a
So
little
we have
bit.
a lot of folks.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different projects. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about her. You said she focuses on Black fugitivity. Was that the word you used?
Yeah. So I first saw Jatavia's work at the Ann Arbor Film Festival in 2015. She had this really sort of wonderful film called An Ecstatic Experience. And with this work, which is still in progress, she's focusing on the sort of role of, and to my understanding, sort of the depiction of Black women in sort of like, as well as the sort of like in certain, in the sort of Western art canon. So she was in France where she was doing a lot of her shooting, specifically around the garden that Monet depicted. And so that's one of the things that she's focusing on while she's here. So
and she's doing a workshop this Saturday, you said?
No, that's tomorrow too,
Tomorrow?
for our youth program.
Okay.
So we are just gathering materials right now on everything from nail polish to pins and sewing reams, and she's going to be teaching a handmade film workshop, sort of working on traditional old school 16mm film, and sort of teaching the youth like what they can do with this actual physical material. So a lot of our focus is on video and digital arts, but we still also have a connection to the sort of like tools that folks use, like that have been invented at this point for over 100 years. Like 16mm film and 35mm.
So when you say handmade film, tell us a little bit more about what that means.
Yeah, so it's a film strip that it generally implies that an artist who has directly worked upon the film strip. So it may have gone through a camera, it may not have. It may have been developed, it may not have been developed. But it usually implies somebody who is like physically making an imprint upon this physical object in some form or another. That could be anything from putting stickers on it, it could be scratching it, it could be sticking moths at it. Of course, one of the more famous examples is Stan Brackage's Mothlight, where he stuck a number of sort of moth wings and other things on, and then ran it through a projector. Because like the nice thing about film is that it is a physical medium. It's something you can touch, it's something you can tear, it's something you can play around with and sort of look into the sort of fissures that can erupt within it.
So the way we would experience her art, it would be projected, but she would have worked on the film strip by hand.
Ostensibly, yeah, if she wanted to. I mean, she could also just be showing it as like
showing the physical film, or projecting it, or both.
Of course.
Okay.
So it's very tactile.
Yeah.
You know.
So she'll be teaching youth tomorrow some of those techniques. Tell us a little bit about some of your youth programming and how folks can access that.
Sure. So our youth programming, we have a number of different programs, including our partnership with the Buffalo Youth, Buffalo Center for Art and Technology, aka BCAT, which is what Jatavia is going to be collaborating with tomorrow. We have our sort of long-running Tech Arts for Girls program, which takes place on Saturdays. We, our education director and coordinator, just wrapped up a sort of very busy summer of all sorts of youth workshops, from everything from VR to silent film techniques, like all sorts of really fun stuff. So we certainly have a lot of summer programs that folks can be part of. We also have a sort of like skill-based building program that we collaborate with Push Buffalo called Westside Studios. And that's sort of like focused over at Push, I believe, and we focus on like sort of giving kids sort of essential skills that they might be able to use in jobs. So we have a lot of different programs that can work for a lot of different people.
Good to know. So Ekrem, you grew up in Turkey. You've spent quite a few years in Buffalo, but you've also been in Austin, Texas. Tell us a little bit about the digital arts scene in Buffalo. What are some of the assets that we have here when it comes to digital arts? What are some of the challenges for people working in that field here? Some of the opportunities when you compare us with other places that you're familiar with?
I mean, the main advantage Buffalo has is, of course, its sort of like long-held legacy of media arts, starting from the 60s on. When Gerald O'Grady was tasked from the University of Buffalo to create both the Department of Media Study as well as a separate venue for media arts called Media Study Buffalo. Gerald O'Grady's presence, I think, is sort of like undeniable in the region as well as in other cities in the country, such as Houston and so on. And I think through his efforts, we've had this sort of amazing history of these really influential thinkers, writers, filmmakers, and artists sort of always being in Buffalo, and that Buffalo has always been sort of seen as a hub where people who work outside of the industry can come and be. It's much more so than, for example, even like a city than Austin.
Interesting.
On the other hand, we don't really have too much of an industry.
Right.
We do have some things picking up for like those Transformers movies that were shot here, and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and Keanu Reeves dropping by, which I still remember. So but that's picking up as well. So I think the main advantage is that you have a public as well as a lineage of people who are extremely literate about what media can do and what it can mean. And I think it's a really sort of magical place where people can kind of do what they want, and much more so than in cities like Austin or New York City or San Francisco, which are sort of hubs, but at the same time they're not necessarily accessible to anybody who is only working like day jobs, right? Or just like working at a coffee shop and so on. Buffalo, of course, is getting much more gentrified and difficult to live in too, but it's at a much slower pace than places like Brooklyn or Austin or San Francisco. So organizations like PPG pushed Buffalo. I think y'all's presence here really sort of helps that to ostensibly perhaps fix some of those problems that can accompany sort of like an unregulated and sort of like cruel growth.
Yeah. So Squeaky Wheel is obviously very community oriented. There's always been kind of a university related side to you, but you've always been in downtown Buffalo serving youth, serving the community, making tools accessible to all comers. Tell us a little bit about the role of digital arts in community building and in activism in particular, and social justice work of the sort that many of our partners are engaged in. I feel like we often miss some of the potential to use digital media and digital art in our work, and I'd be curious to sort of hear from an expert a little bit about opportunities we might be missing or that we could do more with as we try and advance social justice here in Buffalo.
I don't know. I mean, like in a certain sense, I think there is a sort of. I think the past sort of like 10 or so years, from everything from the murder of Trayvon Martin to the Arab Spring, to like all these sort of instances of sort of state-sponsored violence, have also sort of coincided with a time when more people have access to these digital tools and are sort of like know how to use them really well at the same time. I think that, so in a certain sense, we're already doing it, is what I'm trying to say. And I think it's kind of amazing, and I think it has really sort of changed not only how we think about activism, because another way to perhaps think about it is that even though we're already in these strictures like, say, Facebook or something like that, and these sort of things, sort of content providers have their own sort of rules and sort of limitations. If you think back maybe 60 years ago or 80 years ago, when some people in the United States had Super 8 cameras to be able to represent themselves, to be able to show themselves, right? But a lot of other countries in the world didn't. And now we are at a time where, despite these sort of strictures that Facebook and things provide, more people than ever can actually depict themselves and show themselves, and and I think that is crucially changing the way the general discourse. I think that the discourse in the past 10 years has been absolutely, it's not like it didn't exist before, but the sort of wave that has come about through it has been like amazing.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference that it makes as we move from communication that was more based on the written word to communication that's more based on images, whether they're still images or moving images? When we're talking about social justice in particular and community work, what are some of the differences that it makes, or what are some of the trends that you see, or things we should be thinking about as we watch that transition unfold? People are getting their information more and more in a visual rather than a verbal way. So what does that mean for what we're all doing, or what we should be doing?
What we should be doing. I think a lot of us are already doing what we're doing. I think we're already, I mean, I think the more important thing is because these images are so easy to create, and because they're so disposable, we can treat their content similarly. So not necessarily give people the care that we might show otherwise. And what I mean by that is, for example, when we're on Facebook, for example, like sometimes like the sort of callous way that a lot of people can just like post very violent images that I think, you know, are for the intention of like provoking empathy or making us act, you know, but instead what they do is actually enforce a sort of certain way of looking at the bodies as well. So I think it's important, and I think these conversations are happening online too, where a lot of people are sort of reacting towards it as well. So I think it's important to sort of like just like consider what we are shooting and whether we are not making any presumptions on others.
Now we've seen a trend where people are more and more getting their news from Facebook and Twitter in particular, as opposed to traditional TV, radio, print media. Do you have a sense of where that trend is headed? Are people going to be, do you think it's going to be Facebook and Twitter? Someone just said to me, Twitter's going to be dead in like 3 years or something like that.
So I hear, yeah.
Where are people going to be getting their news from? A different source that's less dominant right now, but that's rising, or is Instagram going to take over the world, or what do you see happening?
I hope not. I love Instagram. I don't want to read news on Instagram. It's a changing wave. I think if we don't necessarily, I think it's going to, especially with the way the FCC seem to be going right now, with sort of ostensibly revoking net neutrality rules and so on, it might end up sort of turning more and more into something like cable TV. I mean, disinformation has always existed, right? Like, I mean, like anybody who has grown up in a sort of repressive government already knows that it's not necessarily the news that you read, but it's news you read in between the lines, right? So, so I don't necessarily think that the act is new. I think the amount of it and the reach of it that it has is more new, right? I mean, my answer is roughly like I don't know. I don't know what the tech heads at Silicon Valley are preparing for our doom. You know, like, who knows?
Right. Certainly a very fast-changing landscape, though. Well, we are getting short of time. I want to give you a chance just to tell people again about upcoming events or anything else that you want to make sure people know about, that they would have a chance to interact with Squeaky Wheel about in the upcoming days and weeks.
Sure. As mentioned, our exhibit is open all through the end of the month on the 26th. And over the next 2 weeks, our residents are going to be teaching a plethora of different master classes and seminars. This is everything from how to devising performance for the camera, and that's everything from your webcam to everything else. A documentary in virtual reality. I think this is a big topic because there's a lot of works that feature VR that are supposed to evoke empathy by just being in a different country, and I think that's super problematic, so I think that masterclass is going to be great. This Friday, we have a big outdoor event at the Birchfield Penny Art Center, starring Brian Milbrand and a string quartet, sort of focusing on the sort of grandiose figure of Napoleon called Variations of Napoleon. And they'll be outside. Bring your blankets. It'll be great.
All right. Well, I want to thank Ekrem Serdar from Squeaky Wheel for being on the...
Everybody over there!
Get on up.
Everybody right there!
Get into it.